Welcome back to the Empower Students Now podcast. I am Amanda Werner, your host. I am so excited about the next few episodes coming out on this podcast because I've been thinking about them for a really long time, ever since I finished a book called NeuroTribes by Steve Silberman. It is a very dense book. It covers the history of autism. And the reason that I think that this is a really, really important topic is because it helps us make sense of how we got where we are today in terms of our understanding about autism and in terms of all of the misconceptions and misunderstandings about what autism is. This book attempts to explain that. And I know most people are not like me and going to pick up a book and read. It is, I don't even know, 600 pages. It even has an index. That's how long it is. It's almost, I would consider it like an encyclopedia. It's 480 pages. So it's incredible. It's a very well-written book, but it can also be a bit overwhelming trying to tell you about it because there's just so much to it. So that's why I'm going to record multiple episodes talking about this book. And the goal is to help teachers like you and parents understand how we got here, why so many misconceptions exist, and why there's so many just rampant, just misunderstandings about autism, and why it's so hard for families navigating the mental health system and the public school system when their child has or is autistic. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to the Empower Students Now podcast, a podcast about equity, neurodiversity, mindfulness, and student engagement. There's a lot that needs to change in our education system. The good news is teachers have the power to make these changes now. This is a content warning. This episode discusses very emotionally charged topics that may be difficult for some listeners. Please take care of yourself and listen when you feel ready, or you can skip this episode entirely. This isn't going to be a book report. It's more about just me giving you just the most important essential components, important in my opinion, to answer the question, why are there so many misconceptions about autism? And I really do think that going back in history, going back in time to understand how autism was researched and who had a voice in defining autism. And so let's go ahead and dive in. So the book does have modern day stories as well. And actually, there's a really important family that is, their story is woven throughout the entire book. And they are actually a family that lives in the Bay Area. I'm not sure if they're still living in the Bay Area, which is really cool for me because, I've never met this family, but I live in the Bay Area too. I think Steve Silberman might as well, but I am about to move, so I can't say that for much longer because I'm moving in about 2.5 weeks, which is, you're probably wondering, how are you recording this right now, Amanda? You know what? I don't really know, but I'm doing it. So it's good to have sort of a distraction from all the stresses of my life. And I'm not teaching right now. And so this is definitely something that I'm just really passionate about and excited to share about. So this family, they are the Rosa family. And so they're Craig and Shannon Rosa, talented people who have, I think, 3 kids. And one of them, 2 of them are girls, and one of them is a boy, Leo. And Leo, they talk about the journey this family went through with their sons, specifically their son Leo, but I feel like there are hints that their daughters are also maybe on the spectrum, and maybe the parents themselves. This is just a guess. The book does not say that though at all. But I think there's certain quirks that I are like sort of little clues to me that someone might be neurodivergent or autistic, but I'm not going to go into that. So yeah, this family, I really could relate a lot to what they went through, just trying to support their son and just being told all of these different things about what they needed to do, and how it was sort of an emergency that they needed to start ABA, which is applied behavioral analysis. And I'll talk about that in this series and how that even began in the first place, and how they needed to get him tested and like to get his like blood work done, and like just to change his diet, and like that he had mercury or something in his body, and like just really scary stuff. And they just got sucked into like all of these different fads, I guess, or and even the anti-vaccination stuff they sort of got, they researched. I mean, they were a family that really was just doing their best to learn as much as possible to support their son. And I can relate so much to what they went through, because there's so much out there that purports to help autistic kids and their families, but really it just muddies the water and confuses things and sets autistic kids and their parents off. Like they cause meltdowns. Changing an autistic kid's diet is incredibly hard and challenging. And so that the book does begin with this family, but it also begins with Steve Silberman. He's a journalist, and he worked for Wired magazine, I think. And he was just meeting all of these people in Silicon Valley. And and these people who are very talented, working at Apple and Google, and just going like really like having like PhDs and master's degrees, and just really, really, really talented, intelligent people. And and seeing this pattern of these people, like the Rosas, having kids that were being diagnosed with autism, and noticing these parents and these people in Silicon Valley having all of these quirks, and really like he actually calls it the geek syndrome. Yeah, and just sort of talks about these patterns that he's seeing in all of these people who are scientists and in tech and things, and having kids that are being diagnosed with autism. And just they're just really passionate people, very driven people. And he actually, I guess he was sitting in a coffee shop talking to someone about these kind of patterns he's noticing in this community, the Silicon Valley community. And this person overhears Steve Silberman, the author, talking to someone he's talking to at a cafe. And the person kind of interrupts their conversation. This is in the introduction of the book. And it's a woman, and she says, it says, I'll just read it to you. Suddenly, a trim, dark-haired young woman at the next table blurted out, "I'm a special education teacher. Do you realize what's going on? There is an epidemic of autism in Silicon Valley. Something terrible is happening to our children." Her words were chilling. Could that be true? Or could they be true? Could her words be true? And so he says, I started reading every news story about autism I could find and downloading journal articles by the score. It soon became clear that the mysterious rise in diagnoses was not restricted to Silicon Valley. The same thing was happening all over the world. So, this, that's what this book kind of sets out to do. Like, what's going on here? And Silberman does so much research to learn about the history of autism. And so he starts, with the Rosa family. He starts in Rosa in modern times and talks about their experiences with their son Leo and just the struggles that he was having with misbehavior in school and at home, and then all the different things that the parents tried. And I'll talk more about them later. But then he sort of goes back in time to Vienna and Hans Asperger, who had a clinic, and I think he was a pediatrician at first, but he was also running this clinic, this psychology clinic where autistic children were being studied. And the word autism was coined before Hans Asperger started this clinic. It was coined by a guy named Eugene Bleuler. And I don't know if Eugene Bleuler I'm not saying his last name correctly, is even talked about in this book. He probably is. There's so many people talked about in this book. But the term autism was first introduced by this guy when he was describing schizophrenia in 1911. So autistic children were often diagnosed with childhood schizophrenia. But it is interesting just looking at the word autism, because auto means self and tism is like condition of self. So what they were noticing was that these autistic children, well, this Eugene Bleuler, he was thinking they were schizophrenic, but that they were very they were very self-centered, self-absorbed, not really interested in others, I guess, is kind of where the term came from, which I sort of hate because I know that there's one right there at the very beginning when the term is coined, there's a misunderstanding about autistic people that's being perpetuated just in the name autism. Because we know that people with autism, people who are autistic, are not self-centered and are interested in socializing. They're just overwhelmed by the world because of their sensitivities. Okay, so let's go back to Hans Asperger. So he was living in Vienna, Austria, and he had this clinic, and the clinic was really, really unique. They were doing very innovative things. And the more that I read about him and this nun that worked for him, Sister Victorine Zach, the more that I was just really taken by their approaches and feeling like, wow, this is how I approach children too, where you're genuinely interested in their perspective and you treat them with kindness and openness and curiosity. And that's what they were doing. They were really trying their best to support them and to show them care. So it was very different than a lot of other, institutions at the time in the way that they were treating people with disabilities or mental illnesses. So the really important key point here is that he really believed in seeing the whole person, and he saw autism as a broad spectrum that included children who were nonverbal and had a lot of support needs, and children who were highly verbal and gifted. So both those groups were included in his broad idea of what autism was. And he used the term autistic psychopathy, which is not like what we say, but like it just means like a self-focused personality. And he used a strength-based approach, which I advocate as well, where he helps kids, or he helped kids just strengthen what they were good at, right? Like, so whatever they were interested in, he would try and bring that out in them. He said actually that there's a quote here that for autistic kids to be successful, or for anyone to be successful in science or art, they had to have a dash of autism. That was essential, which I think is really fun for him to have, just realized that so early. I mean, this is like the 1930s, and we all know what was going on, or what was about to happen, which was the Nazi occupation. So that added a whole other layer of complexity to what was going on here. And I think there's a lot of people that later on in history believed that Asperger was a Nazi, but Silberman presents evidence that Asperger actually tried to protect a lot of his patients and spoke up, even in front of Hitler himself, against eugenics programs, which were programs to kill autistic kids. And actually, Nazis, this is so sad. And I think I probably need to add a trigger warning to the beginning of this episode now that I'm telling you this, but Nazis experimented with their strategies for mass genocide on disabled kids, autistic kids first, before they went on to start exterminating Jews, which is just mind-blowing to me and makes me so sad to think about all the people who were killed. So I also want to talk about Sister Victorine Zach, because she was someone who was talked about in the book. She worked at Asperger's Clinic, and she developed individualized strengths-based educational methods for autistic children. And this is just really progressive and innovative and this stuff happened a century ago, which is just amazing. And I think this woman's name has been lost to history, which is really sad. So I want to bring up her name because she was a really important person in this clinic and for Asperger and for this approach, this humanizing approach to taking care of these kids and to understanding these kids. There were many people who worked at this clinic. Two of them were George Frankel and Annie Weiss. And Frankel worked closely with Asperger and was very familiar with their approach. And, when the Nazis started coming in and taking over, he and Annie Weiss, they escaped the Nazis and were able to escape with the help of a guy named Leo Kanner. And he worked at Johns Hopkins. And he's kind of the father of child psychiatry. He is, that's what he's known for, Leo Kanner. And he published a lot of papers. And there's a paper that he published in 1943 where he identifies 11 children, and he says they had early infantile autism. And he describes autism super narrowly, not the way that Asperger described autism. He described it as a very rare, severe childhood condition. And he noted that the parents of his patients were highly educated and accomplished. But over time, this morphed into this really terrible, toxic idea that parents of these children were emotionally cold, and that was why their kids became autistic. And there was a word, I don't think that Kanner coined this term. I think it was another person. And I think, do I have that in my notes? Yes, Bruno Bettelheim. He coined the term refrigerator mothers. This is just really sad because parents that have autistic kids, like, that's hard enough. But then for these people in the 1940s to start blaming the parents for why their kid is the way they are, it just adds like so much more pain, on top of the experience of having, to deal with challenges that come with autism. This is what was so wild to me. Kanner received all the credit for discovering autism in the United States at Johns Hopkins, while Asperger's broader, more humane framework was buried in history, partly, I think, because, Asperger published in German, so there was a language barrier, but also because I think a lot of people thought Asperger was a Nazi. And just the war going on and the chaos around all of that. And also that Kanner, by the way, Kanner's last name is with a K, so it's Kanner, if you want to look him up. He didn't, this is according to Silberman, the author of NeuroTribes, he didn't want to share the spotlight. Even though he was working with two of the people that worked with Asperger in Vienna, he worked with the Frankels. Well, and I think Annie ended up marrying George or something, George Frankel and Annie Weiss. So he worked with them, and yet he never really referred to Asperger in any of his papers or any of his work. So Kanner's narrow definition of autism being rare and autism being devastating rather than common and varied, and these kids having these really, really amazing gifts, the way that Asperger described them. So Kanner won out in history. And so children who didn't fit the narrow mold were undiagnosed or misdiagnosed for decades. And so this humanizing, individualized educational approach that's like the nun, Sister Victorine, took was lost in favor of a deficit model. And I think this has had ripple effects even to today. And so this history, it set the stage for parent blaming and for harmful interventions that I will cover in the next episode of this series. So we've inherited a system built on Kanner's narrow framework. When we see students as too verbal or too social to be autistic, that's Kanner's impact on us today. When we focus on deficits and problems rather than strengths, that's the legacy of what was lost when Hans Asperger's broader view was suppressed and forgotten. Understanding this history is the step toward doing better in our classrooms today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to learn about this important topic. And I hope you learned a lot. I'll come back next time with our next episode in this series about more of the history of autism and how it has impacted us today. Talk to you next time. Bye.